Hello world, welcome back to Razor RC. I'm putting together a video talking about all the tuning adjustments on your Arrma 6S line of vehicles. So I've got my Kraton 6S EXB here in front of us, a brand new kit, and one of the cool things about this kit is that it actually has a lot of racing type adjustments in the vehicle, a lot of changes you can make to get the car to drive exactly how you want. I was pretty surprised about that, but I guess maybe not too surprised because Arrma basically came out of Team Durango, which was a full-on race kit building company. So going through the Arrma Kraton 6S EXB, I did notice a lot of things you can do to get to drive how you like. So I just want to cover that here in this video. So we'll kind of start from the front and then go to the back and go over the adjustments I see, and then we'll talk about what they actually do, what they're called, and then when you might actually want to make changes to them. So let's take a look at the front end. So on the front end, we'll start with the shocks, and one of the cool things about the Arrma is that it does have different shock mounting locations up top here on the shock tower. It's actually 3 different positions up top, and then on the bottom there's really only 1 position. Some other vehicles have multiple positions, but here they only got 1, which is fine. Generally you're going to be using the top holes anyway. So I have a video on this on what the shock locations actually do, but in a nutshell, the more inward you go on the shock, so kind of laying it down, moving that shock position inward a little bit will basically soften the initial feel of the shock. So when you're getting on the brakes, diving into the corner, and you kind of get that initial compression of the shock, it kind of dives in a little bit there. That's just going to soften a little bit before you kind of get into the stiffer part of the spring rate. Moving it out on the shock tower will actually stand them up and actually make the springs feel and shocks feel just a little bit stiffer overall. So that's just the shock location. So in general, if you want a little more initial corner steering, maybe you're diving into that corner, the front end's not biting very well, it just kind of understeers and doesn't seem to kind of enter the corner very well, well then you might want to try moving the shock in a little bit. It's kind of the same thing as softening the spring, but it's only on that initial compression of the shock. So that's the difference between going with the stiffer spring versus moving the shock in a little bit. Moving it in softens a little bit, gets you that initial softness, but then it'll go ahead and stiffen up through the rest of the shock. So that's why you want to move it in. Now moving it out actually stiffens the shock overall. So maybe if you're doing big jumps, you want stiffer shocks overall. Maybe you can't find stiffer springs. That's one way to accomplish that, get your shocks feeling a little stiffer. It also makes the buggy overall, or truggy overall, feel more connected or direct to the actual surface. So on a higher traction surface like on the street, maybe you're running road tires or something like that, doing high-speed runs, you want a little more direct feel on the vehicle. Actually moving it out will actually make kind of stiffen in the front end and make it, if you already have the traction, you can actually use it, get a little more quickness on the steering, but it may make it also a little more nervous. Whereas laying it down kind of softens the front end, it lets it dive into a corner a little bit more. But if you're just doing general road bashing or something like that, it'll kind of numb the front end a little bit because it's just kind of softening the front end. So that's what the shock positions do. Next we'll move on to the sway bars or anti-roll bars here in the front. So Arrma does also make different thicknesses of sway bars. So I think this comes with a 2.4. They also make like a 2.6, maybe even a 2.8. So what the sway bar does in a nutshell is basically connect the left and right arms. So as one side compresses, as one arm kind of moves, it kind of causes the other one to kind of follow it a little bit. Obviously, the stiffer the sway bar, the more connected the two ends are going to be, and then the thinner the sway bar or no sway bar allows them to kind of work independently. So why would you want to use different sway bars? Well, in general, the stiffer sway bar kind of like numbs the front end a little bit. So let's say you're going into a corner, the front end dives a little bit, you start steering. Having a softer sway bar will allow basically the front end to dig in, bite hard, and then go around. So on like a loose type surface like dirt or something like that, a thinner sway bar will give you a little more initial steering, allow the front end to kind of dig independently and give you maximum traction. On let's say the road or a really high traction surface, maybe you're running street tires on the street, you have tons of traction, the front end seems super twitchy, really nervous, just kind of wants to wander all the time, with just like minor inputs to the steering wheel. Well, a stiffer sway bar is actually kind of numb the front end because the two arms are kind of more locked together. So when one side goes, the other side kind of follows, and it just kind of like will tend to understeer a little bit more if you're, if you find it like oversteering a little too much. So that's why you might want to go a stiffer sway bar, higher traction surface. The front end seems too nervous. You want to kind of tone it down, tame it down. That's one way to go. So that's the sway bars. Other interesting things on this crane is that there's adjustments here on the arms. So this is obviously the pillow ball or pivot ball type suspension. And there are actually these cool little clips. So I don't know if you can tell real quick, but yeah, there's these little plastic clips that you can pull out basically to make adjustments. So there's one on this end of the arm and then one on this end of the arm. We'll talk about this one first. So this is basically what's called the camber adjustment. So camber is basically what angle your tire sits at. So just assume there's kind of a tire sitting here. If you pull out that clip and tighten that pivot ball down, it will actually bring in the top of the tire in a little bit. So the overall tire will be a little more angled, a little more angle. And then if you add clips, it'll actually just kind of straighten it up a little bit. In general, for an off-road car, you want to run between -1 and -2 degrees of camber. So -1 means from straight up and down. You want -1 degrees, -2 degrees would be in even a little bit more. I don't think there's really probably any reason to change this. If you only drive straight, maybe you would just leave the wheels straight up and down, but for the most part, anywhere between -1, -2 degrees would be fine. If you have no other options, you're trying to like stiffen the front end or make the front end understeer a little bit more, you could basically remove all these clips, bring in the wheels in a little bit like that. You'll just lose traction overall in general on like the street. Now, if you're on the dirt, that might actually help you gain a little more traction because as the wheels turn, as your buggy kind of rolls into a corner, that inside wheel is going to basically need to be at an angle to the ground, and so that's kind of why you set this to kind of get that optimal angle. But for the most part, -1 degrees or -2 degrees should be fine, pretty much under all conditions. So I wouldn't really mess with that a whole lot. Now moving on to the actual clips here. So there's also clips up top, which basically adjust where this top arm sits. So you can either scoot it back a little bit by moving all the clips to the front, or you can scoot it to the front a little bit by moving all the clips to the back, of course. What that actually does is just slide this left and right a little bit, which will actually change this angle here. So this angle between the top pivot ball and the bottom pivot ball is basically called caster. That angle there basically is kind of like rake on a motorcycle or on a bicycle. Basically, kind of the more laid down you have it, kind of the more easy rider type feel you'll get from your Arrma Kraton or Typhon or whatever. So when it's laid down a little bit more, it's just going to be a little bit more lazy feeling. It's going to kind of ride over bumps a little more easily. It's not going to feel quite so nervous, and just overall just kind of cruise through the bumps a little bit better. Probably good for really bumpy surfaces like dirt or BMX parks or whatever. If you're just kind of driving straight, probably also really good for like high speed runs. So if you're going like 70, 80, 90 miles per hour, probably a good thing to lay that down a little bit more. Move all those clips over to the front. Standing it up a little bit more reduces your caster, and it makes it just a little more nervous feeling. So maybe you don't feel like you have enough steering, or you're on a surface where you have tons of traction. You're making like a touring car, or, race car for the street. You're driving around cones or something like that. And then you just want more steering. You want more immediacy on how aggressive it feels cornering. Then you might want to stand it up a little bit. So, this they probably set as kind of an overall general bashing. Lay it down for bumpier surfaces. Maybe you want a laser feel, maybe even high speed stuff, and then stand up a little bit more if you want like more direct, immediate, more of a twitchy feel, just be more aggressive in the steering overall. Okay, also on the front end is a little adjustment. It's really hard to see, but there's actually two different holes here on the steering plate, or Arrma plate as it's called, so that you can actually move this link to where it mounts to the front position or the back position. Out of the box, it looks like it's on the back position. And kind of looking at this truck overall, it looks like the back position is a little bit more of a straight Arrma type position, whereas moving it forward is going to give you more Arrma. So what is Ackerman? Ackerman is basically the difference between the inside and outside tires when you're at full lock. So when you're turning the car fully to the right here, the inside tire is actually going to be angled a little bit more than the outside tire. And the reason for that is when this thing goes around a corner, the inside tire actually follows a shorter path than the outside tire. You know, if you draw a kind of curve, the inside curve is a lot shorter, the outside curve is actually a lot longer, so this wheel actually has to spin faster. The inside one is going to follow a shorter route and spin a little bit slower. So Ackerman, that adjustment basically changes what the difference is between the inside and outside wheel. In general, at a slower speed, tighter corner, you're going to need that inside tire to be much more angled than the outside corner. At a high speed, less of a sharp corner, then you're going to need less Ackerman overall. So that's what that does to adjust. I guess, I don't think too many people play with that, but you can definitely adjust how much of a difference in angle between the inside tire and outside tire is. You might want to adjust it if you're on a really tight, narrow, little course or something. You're trying to go around little corners and stuff. That might actually help. But overall, probably you don't need to change that. But that's just kind of explanation of what those holes actually do. The other thing I want to talk about on the front end is something called the droop screws. So there's kind of these screws down here, a little bit hard to see. But you can basically take a hex driver, turn that screw in a little bit or loosen it a little bit, and that basically affects how far this axle hangs down from the chassis. So when you loosen that, it allows the arms to extend down even further. So it'll go down a little bit further, give you a little more what's called droop, which is the difference between this axle and the bottom of the chassis. So basically how far your wheels and tires and your arms hang down below the chassis. So more droop is going to give you a little more plushness on landing because you're just going to have more shock extension, right? There's more travel basically that the arms and tires and stuff will go through when you're landing a jump. The downside is that if you run a lot of droop when you go around the corners, because those, let's say you're going left around a corner, that inside wheel is going to lift a little bit more, lift a little bit further, and tend to make the car roll a little bit more. So maybe on a flatter, high traction surface, you wouldn't want to run as much droop. It really depends more on how big your jumps are versus like how much of a road type vehicle you want to run. So if you don't want the car to be rolling around as much, you can reduce that droop, tighten that down, and basically keep the truck a little more flat and level as you're going around the corners, as you're driving down the road or whatever. So that's what you would do with the droop screw. If you're doing big jumps, really bumpy type surface, low traction, maybe you want to loosen those droop screws and then allow the arms and wheels and stuff to hang down a little bit more and then give you a little more travel basically on your suspension. Okay, moving on the back end of the vehicle, and there's actually more stuff going on, more adjustments. We kind of talked about the shocks already. There are actually two different holes you can mount the shocks on up top. Again, inner hole is going to soften the initial rate of that shock, and then the upper hole or outside hole is going to just make it feel more direct, more stiff, and tend to slide around a little bit more. So kind of just depends on the type of surface you're running on. Maybe a looser type surface where you have a hard time with the tires kind of digging in. Maybe the rear end is staying up a little bit too high. You want it to squat a little bit more. You can basically move it to the inside. Might give you a little more traction. Higher traction surface, the road or whatever, you probably want to run more the outside hole or top hole, and then keep that shock nice and stiff. Now I did notice that there are multiple holes here on the bottom. Kind of does the same thing but in the opposite direction. So moving it out, basically kind of lay it down, make it a little bit softer on that initial part, where standing it up is going to make it a little more direct. So that's kind of what it is. It doesn't look like you would ever actually run this. Maybe this is for like a longer shock or something like that, but yeah, that's kind of interesting that they have that holes. Maybe it's for other vehicles. Again, the sway bar on the rear, I think it's also a 2.4 millimeter sway bar. Running thicker sway bar is going to basically lock the left and right arms together a little bit more, kind of lock up that rear end. So if you want the car to kind of slide around the corner, oversteer a little bit more, you can run a thicker sway bar, especially on like something like higher traction surfaces. Probably run a thicker sway bar. If you're on really loose dirt, don't have much traction, it's already sliding around too much, then you want to try maybe a thinner sway bar, give you a little more traction. On the back of the vehicle, also you have these camber links. So instead of the pivot balls, you have just your traditional camber links. You may have noticed there's 4 holes here on the hub, 4 holes here on the shock tower, so that there's basically 2 adjustments you can make. You can raise or lower the camber link on one end, and then you can shorten or lengthen the camber link overall. So if you move this to the outside hole, you're lengthening the camber link. You would want to adjust your camber again. Let's say you're running -1 degrees. You want to reset it to -1 degrees by spinning this turnbuckle. But in general, lengthening the camber link overall will give you what's called camber gain. So the length of the camber link adjusts how much gain you have. So if you notice, the wheel might be straight up and down when your truck is, at rest here, but then as you compress the suspension, it actually tends to get pulled in a little bit more. So as the suspension compresses, it'll get a little more angled. As it extends back out, it'll be a little more straight up and down. So that affects that camber gain, how much that wheel will start to tilt as you compress the suspension. So in general, a longer link is just going to make it stay straight up and down a little bit more. Probably slide a little bit more as you go around the corner, because you kind of want this angle not completely straight to the ground, because the truck's kind of rolling kind of as it's sliding around the corner, getting on power, and so that tire needs to be at a little bit of an angle. If you keep it straight up and down, it's going to tend to slide a little bit more as the suspension compresses, and not be quite as locked in. In terms of the holes going up and down, so in general, as the angle turns in like this a little bit more, so it starts to point down towards the center of the vehicle, either by raising it up here on the outside or lowering it here on the inside. You're basically, it's called raising the roll center. So raising the roll center makes that link a little more angled. Basically makes it tend to slide around the end a little bit more instead of roll. So if you find your truck just rolls too much, maybe it rolls and traction rolls a lot, well, you could try basically raising your roll center by making that link a little more angled. Now on the other hand, if you find it slides a little bit too much, you're not getting enough traction, well, you can go the other way. Basically lower the outside hole here or raise the inside hole, get that link a little more angled like this, and instead of sliding around the corner, it'll kind of tend to roll and let your tires kind of dig in and get some traction before you actually accelerate out. So yeah, that's pretty much it. The adjustments on the rear end, you have the droop screws, same as before. On the front end, they work exactly the same. Loosening that droop screw will basically give you a little more plushness, allow the shocks and arms and wheels and everything to extend down a little bit lower, give you more droop, and then give you more shock extension, and basically allow more travel on your suspension as well. So I think that pretty much covers all the adjustments on the Arrma line of vehicles. I think this applies to most of them out there. They all pretty much share similar parts. So it's pretty cool that Arrma actually has a lot of like race style type adjustments. I hope you may have learned something from this and get to kind of play with it, get your vehicle to drive a little more how you like. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So definitely like, share, subscribe, hit the add notifications button. Look for more videos soon. Thanks for watching.